event was hosted by the Asia Society in New York City.
Give you a little introduction of my own to this wonderful friend of mine, Anita Raghavan. I first met her way back in 1995. I was then with Business India magazine, and I'd come to New York, and I was looking around for stories to do, and I decided to do a story on Indian journalists who were rising in the mainstream business press. And at that time, when I was interviewing all the people who'd reached the top positions, someone said to me, hey, you know, there's this reporter you must meet at the Wall Street Journal. Her name is Anita Raghavan. And he described her as that bright kid who's going places. At that time, Anita was reporting on the securities industry here. And, well, she did go places, because I met her again in, just a couple of years ago when our paths crossed at Forbes, and Anita was appointed the London bureau chief. And now with this book, I can assure you that Anita is going to go further afield. So, Anita, let's start off. You've been wanting to write about the whole South Asian diaspora. And why did you choose this particular case? What was so compelling to tell that story at this point in time?
Well, I was fascinated by the fact that Raj Rajaratnam, this Sri Lankan street fighter, had managed to seduce some of the best and brightest of the Indian American community. You had Rajat Gupta, the three-time chairman of McKinsey, Anil Kumar, his protege, who had gone to some of the finest schools in India, the Doon School, IIT Delhi. And I wanted to know, what was it that Raj had that managed to cast a spell over so many of India's finest?
But don't you think that, in a sense, it was not the brightest moment for the community to be telling that story now?
It wasn't, but I think through the story, you were able to tell the tale of the rise of the community, because all the individuals that are involved in this case came, post-1965, after U.S. immigration laws were relaxed, and did fantastically well in a very short period of time. And so you had the whole trajectory of the community, its highs and its lows.
The other thing I just wanted to ask you, I've been meaning to ask you, the title. I just love the title. So how did you really hone in on that particular title?
Well, if I can start by saying we had many titles before this title. The first title, which is my favorite, was Sons of the Morning, and it came from a hymn that I loved when I was in boarding school, because it captured this idea of the Indians the Indian American elite that got caught up in this case as being the best and the brightest of India. I guess not everyone knew the hymn from boarding school, and so that was quickly cast aside. And then we toyed with two kings, because Raj, in a way, was the king of wealth, and Rajat was a different sort of king, a king of thought. He was a strategist from McKinsey. He had a certain ability about him, and I don't want to give away any trade secrets, but I think Hachette was selling another book with Two Kings as the title, so that quickly had to to be cast aside. And finally, we wanted to focus a bit on what was this book about, and I think we came to the idea of we came to the idea of the billionaire's apprentice because Rajat at some point in his career wanted to have what Raj Rajaratnam had, and it was the billions.
Well, I thought maybe you could read a little bit from your book, and that sets the stage for a further discussion.
Okay. The passage I'm going to read from is from the beginning of the book, and it's Rajat Gupta at the start of his life, and it tells you a little bit about Rajat, and it also tells you about his father, who was a prominent freedom fighter who spent many, many years in jail. A cousin of Rajat's told me when I was in Calcutta interviewing her in 2011, she said jail was like a house to him. So I'm going to start with that. Ever since he was born, Rajat Kumar Gupta was likened to his father. He was as handsome as his father, with the same strikingly chiseled jawline that gave both men a distinguished air, a sense they belonged to a secret world of privilege that went beyond wealth, intellect, or bloodline. In a society where skin color was a defining force, both Rajat and his father Ashwini were fair-skinned, a clear advantage that afforded them a natural superiority. Both were known for their generosity of spirit, an obliging way that over the course of their lives would win them steadfast friends and loyal followers. But beneath the surface, the similarities ended. Unlike his son, Ashwini Kumar Gupta came of age in an occupied country, seemingly fated by his birth in 1908 to live in deference to an imperial power. As a descendant of one of India's oldest bloodlines, Ashwini was also ironically one of the chosen ones. He would be tapped and trained to deny his Indianness and perform like a faux Englishman, all in the service of India's emperor, Her Majesty the King. While he would receive a proper British education like the other esteemed members of his family, Ashwini Kumar Gupta rejected intellectual servitude. On the morning of Thursday, November the 5th, 1964, Ashwini's eldest son, 15-year-old Rajat Kumar Gupta, dressed himself, carefully draping his best white dhoti over his body. Growing up in a close-knit Indian family of 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys, the youngest born after the family moved to New Delhi in the 1950s, Rajat was accustomed to shouldering responsibility. He and his older sister were always looking after their younger siblings. By economic necessity, his parents were a 2-career couple long before it was in vogue. His mother taught at the local Montessori school, and upon his release from prison, Ashwini took up journalism as a means to support himself and his family. His old revolutionary ties to the leaders of a newly free India helped him rise. After India's independence, he was dispatched to start the Delhi edition of the Hindustan Standard. He was a frequent visitor to Rashtrapati Bhavan, the official residence of the President of India, and it was well known among the Delhi press corps that the country's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, called him by his first name. So trusted was Gupta by government ministers that they would often seek his counsel on how to deal with the press. Born as a British subject, Ashwini Gupta, through hard work and sacrifice, became an insider in modern India. Rajat steeled himself and walked into the anteroom of his uncle's Calcutta home at 19C Rajendra Lal Street to say farewell. Shrouded with heaps of roses, marigolds, and fragrant jasmine, his father lay in a coffin. As was customary, the body was washed in purified water and dressed in a white kurta, a loose-fitting shirt, and a white dhoti. When he'd arrived at the hospital the previous day, he was told that his father was dead. But as he stood at the entrance to his father's room, he saw a plastic bag still attached, bubbling with air from his father's last gasps. For a moment, he thought the doctors had made a mistake, but the years of struggle and incarceration had taken their toll. At 56, Ashwini Gupta was dead of kidney failure. In the months leading up to his father's death, young Rajat had spent a lot of time with his father, accompanying him on long walks and listening to stories of his time in the freedom movement. He learned that his father had been intentionally exposed to TB in prison, which ultimately cost him the use of one lung. The ragged 2-foot-long scar on his back came from his skin being split open over and over again during one particularly brutal interrogation. Yet, in spite of it all, the father he knew was kind and obliging to everyone. He would later recall, "He never spoke ill of anybody, and I would have thought he would have had a lot of resentment built into him. But it wasn't true. This attitude was true of most of my father's generation. They were quite extraordinary in terms of simple living and high thinking and not thinking ill of other people. This morning, in front of Rajat's uncle's house, a crowd gathered. Neighbors, friends, and admirers descended like pilgrims on a sorrowful journey. Door-to-door launderers, dobymen and their donkeys watched as a coffin was placed into a glass-top hearse parked in front of the red brick house with the green shutters. In tribute, the dobymen nudged their donkeys away from the mourners and solemnly cleared a path for the procession. At 9 a.m., the hearse, closely followed by cars carrying the immediate family, departed. As the throng approached the top of the street, Rajat could make out a small shrine to Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction. After a stop at the offices of his father's employers, the newspaper group Ananda Bazar Patrika, he led the crowd to White Town. On the other side of town, Apurva Maitra, Ashwini Gupta's former jailer, raced to catch one final glimpse of the man. He ran to a crematorium known as the Nimtola Burning Ghat, then south to the Keralatora funeral parlor, to no avail. On his last guess, he found the right destination. Clenching a fistful of flowers, he elbowed through a crowd of hundreds of friends, family, and admiring strangers, and made his way beyond the row of bodies stacked in a line to be cremated. At last, after pushing his way past Ashwini Gupta's brother, the former prison guard made it to the coffin. Ashwini Gupta's teenage son Rajat was just completing the final death rite. In the silence that followed, Maitra was able to place what was left of his bunch of lotus flowers on the feet of his fallen friend. Rajat Gupta then helped roll the stretcher, holding his beloved father's body into the orange flames of Calcutta's electric crematorium. Overcome with grief, Maitra muttered a prayer to his dead friend Ashwini. Pray not a grain of hatred remains mingled in your ashes. I tried to atone for my sin. If he hadn't been unwashed in his own sadness at the premature death of one of India's unsung heroes, Maitra might have heard another voice, the tender voice of Rajat Kumar Gupta quietly beseeching a higher power. Who will show me the way in the world?
Anita, you know, this is an incredible amount of rich detail, and really it makes your hair stand on end. How difficult was it, researching and reporting this book? I mean, what sort of reactions were you getting? Because obviously the backdrop was this whole, insider trading scandal. So, you've been a very dogged reporter, but writing a book on this scale and this depth, what was the experience like?
It was very difficult because so many members of the Indian American community who had helped me on many stories before were quite reluctant to speak about this story, because in a way it cast such a poor light, on the community, and I think the diaspora didn't want to draw attention to it. I really had to tap old sources and convince them that while this was a shadow on the community, it also, in a sense, reflected the vibrancy of the community in the United States today. The fact that we have prosecutors and people who mete out justice as part of part of American society is a sign of strength. When my parents came and when I grew up here in the 70s for part of the time, Indians were confined to being doctors and engineers and college professors. Today, we have movie makers, we have writers, and of course, prosecutors like Preet Bharara and the SEC's Sanjay Wadhwa.
It's a much more diverse.
That's right.
So, being an Indian yourself, was that a help, a hindrance? I mean, what did it bring into the story?
I think it was an advantage in the sense that I understood some of the dynamics of the story. The communal differences. The difference between a Sri Lankan and an Indian, or Rumi Khan, who was a Hindu married to a Muslim, and who midway, if you've read the book, midway in the scandal, starts having marital problems and goes over to another Indian friend's home to pray, and it's because he's a Hindu, unlike her husband who is a Muslim. So I think it helped in understanding the cultural forces that played a big role in this story. It was also a challenge, though, because one of the central protagonists of the book is, of course, Rajat Gupta, and here was me, someone of the community, writing a book that was going to shine a spotlight, if you will, on his missteps. And how did you do that? How do you do that in a way that doesn't open you up to accusations of just taking down a hero? And I was cognizant of that as I wrote the book.
In fact, in a large part of the book, I mean, your portrait of Gupta comes across, he comes across as a really upright figure and very principled, and had absolutely earned that position,
right,
to the top ranks of McKinsey. What do you think, since you've really gone into this in such detail, what was the tipping point? I mean, why? I mean, that's the question everyone wants to know. Why?
Yeah, I think, there were a number of factors, but you have to remember that Rajat Gupta had built up his career in the hinterlands, in a way. He'd been in Scandinavia, he'd been in Chicago, and late in life, in the late 90s, he comes to New York, and he's thrust into this new milieu, and it's a bit of a bright lights, big city phenomenon. He's suddenly mingling with Henry Kravis and Hank Paulson, and I think he in some way looked at his 30-year career as a McKinsey salaryman and said, what do I have to show for it? And it's very interesting, all of the descent, if you will, happens after he steps down from the helm of McKinsey. He becomes closer to Rajaratnam in 2005, and in 2004, he gives this talk at Columbia, and I've watched a tape of the talk, and you have the sense of a man really casting about, trying to figure out what was he going to do, how was he going to achieve a new high, and I think he was really struggling.
So that success at McKinsey was not
enough.
Not enough. So he was far more ambitious.
Right.
But when I read the book, of course, Anita, and I was up nights reading it. It was so gripping. It's like it's like a novel. It's like this great Shakespearean tragedy. But when I read it, I got the sense that there is an underlying sympathy that you have for Rajat Gupta that may not have been the case in your interpretation of Rajaratnam and Anil Kumar, who was his colleague, but underlying a huge wave of sympathy for him. Is that correct, or am I misreading?
Well, I mean, that's why I wanted to read you the passage I did, because the picture of Rajat that we all saw over the last several years was a very stoic man. He was this dignified statesman, and I when I went to Calcutta to interview members of his family, and luckily I went there before he was indicted, and they spoke to me very openly, and I said, was Rajat affected at all by his father's death? Because he hardly ever talked about it. His first roommate at McKinsey told me that he didn't even know that Rajat was an orphan. And his cousin said to me, "Of course he was. You know, he was wandering around in a comatose state. You know, he had hopped on a train, you know, from New Delhi and come to Calcutta. You know, when he'd found out that his father was very ill, and the moment he learned he'd died, he was just, you know, in a daze."
So, you know, when you meet, I mean, you met almost 200 people
Yeah.
whilst researching this book.
Some were
And-
on the phone, Nancy.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to know that. I thought you were superhuman. But, you know, you talk to 200 people and then you hear all these different voices, pros and cons. And so how do you sift through all that? How do you arrive at, you know, a true and fair picture that, you know, reflects reality? You must have got a lot of static as well.
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly a core of people at McKinsey who also did not like Rajat, who thought he had taken the firm in the wrong direction, who argued that you could have actually predicted what happened. I felt, you know, the crime, if you will, was so had gotten such press, and Rajat had suffered so much as a result of the crime. You know, I think his lawyer, Gary Naftalis, you know, at the end of the trial said, you know, this is a Greek tragedy of epic proportions. And so, to me, what was more interesting about this story was who was the man, who was the human who ended up in this very bad place.
Yeah, because despite him being so high profile and,
Yeah.
you know, written about extensively, and I remember, you know, meeting Rajat on several occasions, interviewing him, you know, even visiting him at his home, and I thought, oh my God, you know, this is it. This is what success means. He had the golden life. But there was always that sort of barrier. I mean, he always kept, you know, a part of him which was very private.
Right.
So I think, you know, you were able to sort of penetrate that through this book.
Right.
Did you find that difficult? I mean, were people, you know, from his past, you know, you've met, I know, his secretary,
Yeah.
his, you know, you used every source. Was that, you know, difficult for you, or?
I think going to Calcutta was very helpful in understanding Rajat, because you know, his cousins spoke very freely, and they knew the young Rajat, you know, who was rather a precocious child. I mean, I remember a story about how apparently on one family trip he got on the roof of the car, and he wouldn't climb down, and they had to ply him with sweets before he would come down, you know, and you got this sense of a boy who was quite alive, and then suddenly when he was 16 he loses his parents, and his whole persona changes, and you know, I think that struck me.
Well, going to this case now, moving fast forward, do you think that, you know, the whole economic meltdown of 2008 sort of made this, you know, caused this whole case to escalate the way it did? Do you think, you know, that escalation was justified?
You know, a lot of South Asians have asked me, you know, do you think Indians were targeted, you know, in this case? Why aren't they catching, you know, the real culprits of the financial crisis? And, you know, prosecutors are probably not too different from the rest of us, you know, in the way they do their job. You know, if there's an easy case to bring, and this was an easy case to bring once you had wiretaps of Raj Rajaratnam, you know, receiving inside information from various players. You know, if you have an easy case to bring, you will bring an easy case, and you know, trying to prosecute the creators of the mortgage fraud debacle is far harder. You know, you can probably bring cases against brokers who sold these shoddy mortgages, but how do you tie these brokers to the heads of the investment banks? It's very difficult. There are too many layers to penetrate, and I think this was just an easy case to bring.
Do you think the sentence was too harsh for both of them, or?
You know, I don't want to comment on the sentence, but you know, because I don't feel it's my role to. But you know, again, I think that a lot of people have remarked to me, you know, don't you think Rajat Gupta got, you know, a severe sentence? And I actually think Rajat Gupta was very lucky getting the sentence he did. If he was before another judge, I think he would have gotten many more years, because in a way, the crime he committed was far more serious than the one that Raj Rajaratnam committed. He was a board member. He had a fiduciary responsibility to keep the secrets of the board in the boardroom.
Well, in a sense, you know, in India, back home, people in power have a sense of entitlement and, you know, almost expect immunity. Right. This kind of thing would not have happened. Do you think that that sense of entitlement is something that, you know, they bring here as well, or are they well aware of the consequences? I mean, you know, this kind of very blatant behavior that comes across in your book, I mean, what made them believe they could get away with this? Is it to do with that sort of Indian ethos of, you know, power giving you immunity?
I'm not sure it has anything to do with the Indian ethos, because, you know, one of Rajat's best friends, Bill Clinton, also thought he was untouchable. So, you know, I think it's just one of the attendant attributes of power. You know, you have a sense of invincibility, and I think Rajat had gotten to that point in life, you know, where he really thought he was, you know, not going to be affected by this. And here I'm thinking about a lot of reporting I did in the early months when Rajat first found out he had a problem, and his reaction to finding this out was not to be really concerned, and I think it's because he didn't think it would come to much.
I was wondering if you could read a little bit, you know, and give us a flavor of that time when he was really at the peak of his career. And
okay. This as you said, Nazneen, is when Rajat Gupta is at the height of his power, and it's just before actually he finds out he may have a problem. It's his first inkling. But I won't get to that. I'll just keep him at his height of his power. It was Tuesday, November 24th, 2009, and Rajat Kumar Gupta was headed to the White House for the first state dinner hosted by President Barack Obama and his wife Michelle, the most glamorous political couple since the Kennedys. 6 years had passed since Gupta had stepped down as the 3-term global managing director of consulting giant McKinsey. But at 60, he was busier than ever. He sat on a handful of corporate boards, Goldman Sachs, Procter & Gamble, and American Airlines, to name a few. His wife, Anita, had hoped his retirement from the top job at McKinsey would slow him down. But he was in the throes of building his own private equity company from scratch. Jetting from continent to continent, living out of a suitcase, he was as intent on being a game changer in private equity and philanthropy as he had been during a storied career in consulting. Dressed in a black Nehru suit with a red handkerchief tucked in his pocket, Gupta made his way to the white tent on the south lawn from the gilded east room which served as the staging area for the dinner. At every turn, he ran into friends. He chatted with Deepak Chopra, the New Age physician who was wearing his signature gem-studded eyeglasses for the glittering gala. He mingled with Preeta Bansal, a top lawyer in the new administration, and caught up with Bobby Jindal, a former McKinsey consultant, and now the Republican governor of Louisiana. Jindal, whose given name is Piyush, was born in Baton Rouge. His parents migrated to America from the Indian state of Punjab 6 months before he was born. Jindal was typical of the guests at the White House that night. While the ostensible purpose of the evening was to honor the Indian Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, the event also served as a barometer for how far and how fast an immigrant group had risen. In one generation, Indian Americans had vaulted from geeky outsiders to polished players in all facets of American society. If Gupta wanted to make small talk in the security line with a Fortune 500 CEO, he could approach either GE's Jeffrey Immelt or Indra Nooyi, the CEO of PepsiCo, who was born and bred in Chennai. If he wanted to bask in the reflected glow of a TV presenter, he could chat with Katie Couric or the Mumbai-born Fareed Zakaria. Hollywood was represented at the event. Both Steven Spielberg and the Indian director of The Sixth Sense, M. Night Shyamalan, whose birthplace is Pondicherry, were in attendance that night. As one of the pioneering Indian success stories in the United States, Gupta knew almost all the Indian invitees, and as a McKinsey legend, their non-Indian counterparts too. He had worked with many and served as a mentor to others. When Neil Kumar Katyal, the principal deputy solicitor general, was in high school and getting pressure from his Indian parents to study medicine, Gupta advised him to follow his dreams. Katyal's position in the Justice Department as one of the chief attorneys representing the government before the U.S. Supreme Court was a testament to the heights to which Indians had risen in American society. As you looked around the room that night, it was breathtaking to see the diversity and depth of talent, says Timothy J. Romer, at the time the U.S. ambassador to India. There were CEOs and entrepreneurs. There were doctors, hotel owners, and writers. There were aspiring office seekers and office holders. There were people who had grown up poor in India, but now they were the CEO of the company. You could feel how alive the American dream was in that room, exalts Romer. There was never any question that Gupta would be invited. He was one of the few Indians in America who waltzed through vastly different worlds, business and philanthropy, India and America, without ever losing a step. He was friends with almost all the Indian businessmen accompanying Dr. Singh on his trip to the United States. He was close to Mukesh Ambani, the head of the powerful Indian conglomerate Reliance Industries, who viewed Gupta as one of India's most treasured exports, someone who had reached the pinnacle of corporate and public life in the United States, but had never lost his affection for his homeland. He knew Ratan Tata, often described as the David Rockefeller of India. Tata, whose holdings run the gamut from cars, Jaguar Land Rover, to hotels, Mumbai's iconic Taj Mahal Palace Hotel, had worked early on to help Gupta turn his dream of an Indian business school into reality. But Gupta's most important relationship, one that certainly helped secure an invitation that evening, was his friendship with the guest of honor, Dr. Singh. Gupta was one of the few Indian executives in America who could get the Indian Prime Minister on the phone on short notice. Despite McKinsey's prominence in India, the two were not acquainted in the early 90s when Gupta was a rising star at McKinsey, and Singh, then a little-known finance minister in a previous Indian government, was the architect of a fusillade of economic reforms that dismantled the red tape Raj and ushered in an era of entrepreneurial freedom. But when India prospered in the wake of Singh's reforms, McKinsey thrived, advising a raft of Indian companies on restructuring moves and playing a pivotal role in building Offshoreistan. It was during Gupta's time as managing director that McKinsey opened its groundbreaking knowledge center in a suburb of New Delhi, hiring a fleet of Indian researchers, many with MBAs, to analyze important trends such as cellular phone penetration for McKinsey consultants. When the McKinsey Knowledge Center turned out to be a huge hit, Gupta went global with the idea. He preached the sermon of offshoring to American companies eager to cut costs and pushed them to send more and more of their back office work and support work, corporate research, legal transcription, and financial analysis to India. Clients were thrilled, and in India, Gupta was a corporate rock star, just as recognizable in Mumbai as Jamie Dimon is in New York. It was no small irony, then, that one of his dinner companions at the White House that evening was Labor leader Andy Stern, the president of the company's second-largest union. Stern, whose organization spent the most money supporting Obama, sat between Gupta and his wife Anita at a table sumptuously decorated with gold charger plates and purple and magenta arrangements of roses, sweet peas, and hydrangeas on green apple tablecloths. Over a dinner of green curry prawns, collard greens, and coconut-aged basmati rice, Stern took the opportunity to nudge a key party some consider responsible for the fading prospects of the American worker. He pressed Gupta on why companies like Goldman, whose investors include public pension plans, didn't have more regard for the worker. In his soft-spoken but firm way, Gupta insisted they did. They gave a lot of money away to needy organizations. But Stern had something more radical in mind, profits more broadly distributed to rank-and-file employees. Overhearing the debate were Gupta's dinner companions, Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner and North Dakota Senator Kent Conrad. It was heady company. If anyone had told Gupta back when he was a little boy in Calcutta that he would someday work at, let alone run McKinsey, and be invited to the White House for dinner, they might have had an easier time convincing him that he would walk on the moon. The heights he had attained would only serve to make the events that followed all the more unfathomable.
Anita, I know you're going to close that book, but there's that you referred to that in particular time when the first call came from Goldman Sachs, from their legal counsel, and I thought that was that's his reaction there. I think was he's rushing through the airport. He's it's just it doesn't really sink in. And it's not the reaction of somebody who's, done something wrong. It's clearly the reaction of somebody who's innocent. So how do you square that reaction with, the final conviction?
I don't think even to this day he really believes he did something wrong. And I think I square that reaction, my take on his attitude to Greg Palm, the Goldman General Counsel, who calls him and says, we've heard the feds are investigating you for tipping Raj Rajaratnam. I chalk his reaction up to sort of an arrogance, a belief that if this is a problem, it's going to go away. I'm too powerful to be touched. A bit like Bill Clinton, entertaining someone in the Oval Office and thinking, no one will hear of it.
Yeah. Do you think you could just read a couple of paragraphs from there?
Greg Palm?
The Greg. I just think, that it's so sort of sets the stage for the book. If you can locate that passage. Sorry to spring it on you like that, but thinking back on the book, I think that is important for the audience to understand.
Sure.
Where he started from, and then how it finally unraveled.
Absolutely. Why don't you, while I'm finding the passage here in the book,
isn't it earlier in the book?
Well, the earlier part is when Greg finds out that there's a problem and goes to blank fine. That's earlier, but Gupta's reaction to it is actually later.
Oh.
Gupta's actual reaction to it. I mean, he's rushing through. You want the conversation, and that's later. So.
Yeah.
Okay. So. But if you'd like to ask me something while I'm finding that, I'm happy to.
Well. You talked about, casting a bad light on the community, in this whole case. Does it call into question the whole, Indian success story, so to speak, in the United States? Is it going to make it that much harder for the next generation to reach the heights that Rajat did?
Indians have had a magical journey in the United States. They came in ever greater numbers, starting in the 70s after the Lyndon Johnson reforms, and they, in one generation, have gone on to become top lawyers in this country. Today we're at a point where Srinivasan, is likely to become a federal appeals court judge in D.C. And as you can tell from the opening passage, we had movie makers, politicians, and I do think the scandal involving Rajat and some of the other Indian luminaries will cast a shadow on the community for a while. I remember when I started writing this book, I was at a gala, and a prominent Indian American who heads a bank came up to me and he said, "Anitha, why this book? Why this book?" And you could tell that on some level his own sense of security felt threatened by this episode, even though he had nothing to do with it.
Well, I was just, it's so ironical that, you mention in your afterword in the book that, Anil Kumar, someone like Anil Kumar, where there was a clear money trail and a link between him and Rajaratnam, whereas that was not the case with Rajat. I mean, you just, came to a conclusion because they were business partners and therefore, indirectly he's benefiting. But in Anil Kumar's case, clearly there was a payoff.
Right.
And, he just sang like a canary and got away.
Right.
So it seems somehow, totally unfair. And as you write now that he's, probably getting a second career back home. So do you think that's, Rajat could rehabilitate himself back home quite easily?
Oh, I think it's very likely he will. I was speaking recently to someone, an American who had just come back from India, and he said it's interesting that while the press in the United States about Rajat is overwhelmingly negative, in India he's something of a hero. He is somebody who has been mistreated by an unjust U.S. legal system. So I think Rajat will very easily rehabilitate himself in India, no question.
Well, would you like to quickly,
sure.
Just for a minute?
This actually is 17 days after the first scene at the White House that I read from, and Gupta is about to, he's at Philadelphia International Airport and he's about to board a plane, and he gets a call from Greg Palm, who is the general counsel of Goldman Sachs. Palm caught up with Gupta as he was at the airport. Palm started off his call with Gupta on December 11, 2009 with two unusual disclosures, tip-offs that the conversation they were about to have would be uncomfortable and could potentially make Goldman and Gupta adversaries. Palm told Gupta that he'd arranged to have a colleague on his line listen in on their conversation. Typically, Palm liked to have one-on-one conversations, but he had decided that since the topic was very sensitive, it was important that there be an extra set of ears and an extra pair of hands to record exactly what was said and to monitor Gupta's reaction. If Gupta still had not registered that this call would be different from any other that he had had with a Goldman official, Palm said something else that should have put him on notice. "We're representing the corporation and not you," Palm told him. Palm wanted to make sure that there was no doubt in Gupta's mind that this was not a privileged conversation that would be protected by lawyer-client confidentiality. If the matter evolved into something much bigger, as Palm was expecting, the contents of his conversation with Gupta could be handed over to law enforcement officers investigating the matter. What can you tell me about Raj Rajaratnam, and have you ever provided him with information about what we do? Palm asked, sticking to a script that he had worked out before the call. Gupta was clearly taken aback by the question, not entirely sure what Palm was driving at. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Palm explained to Gupta that Goldman had come to learn that Gupta may have been in contact with Rajaratnam and provided him with information about the firm. Gupta did not fly off the handle or turn evasive. He comported himself in exactly the way Palm and others at Goldman had grown to expect. Very calmly and cerebrally, he denied that he had ever provided Rajaratnam with confidential information about Goldman. Then he went on to explain why the charge was preposterous. He told Palm and the other Goldman lawyer who was listening in that he and Rajaratnam at one time had been business partners on a venture called New Silk Route, but the two had had a falling out and were no longer close. Their parting had stemmed from a soured investment that Gupta had entered into many years back. Gupta said he had poured $10 million into an investment vehicle with Rajaratnam, who had invested more money in the entity. Rajaratnam, Gupta said he later learned, had taken his money out. Meanwhile, Gupta's $10 million investment had gone to zero. Gupta said he had hired accountants and lawyers and was planning to sue Rajaratnam, but then the Galleon chief was arrested. Why would I help out someone with whom I had a dispute? He asked rhetorically.
Thanks, Anita. Just a couple of more questions, final questions before we open it up to the floor. You've kept one very interesting, juicy part of the story right at the end, and I don't want to disclose that because really that's something that Anita's uncovered, which is not common knowledge at all. But I can disclose the title of the chapter is called Family Secret, and it's a pretty explosive secret which gives a different complexion to Gupta's background and what ultimately happened. So I'm going to not disclose the secret because we want you to buy the book, but
or rather, we want you to enjoy the book.
To read the book, sorry. But how did you ever chance upon this?
This was actually common knowledge in Calcutta, and no one really wrote about it out of deference to Gupta's father, who was a journalist. And of course, I wasn't going to write about it based on the chatter, but I had at my disposal in London the wonderful archives of the British Library, and I had a sense of when this incident happened, and so I started looking through old newspapers, and I found out that this was this incident, this episode, was a cause célèbre in Calcutta in the 1930s, and newspapers ran daily stories about the incident, and it had caused great shame and dishonor to Gupta's family because so many of them were steeped in education, in academia, and but even though it was rumored about, by going to Calcutta, I interviewed a number of people who knew Gupta's father, who were very old, and I learned of the circumstances of what really happened. And I felt it was important to include this story because, I think it was this burden the family had carried for so many years, and everybody was aware of it. People talked about it in hushed tones. They said, he did something he should have never done. We're speaking about Gupta's father. And I think it cast a pall over Rajat and his siblings. Yet there was something very honorable in the dishonor.
The parallels there. So finally, Anita, what's the key takeaway from this whole saga? What are the, some would say that, this really paints Indians in a bad light, but how do you view it? I mean, what would you like the readers to understand this book as?
I think it shows that we as a community have arrived in America. We are finally large enough in number. We are economically significant, and as a result, we now have our own crime that will be prosecuted. There will be episodes like this from time to time. But if anything, to me, it's a celebration of the community's strength rather than its weakness.
I think we can open it up to the floor now, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. Do we have a mic? Yes. Please come forward. Just briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you, Khalid Rahman. I'm a physician from New York. Both of you are from Wall Street, so kind of insiders. Does this happen?
I'm not from Wall Street. I'm from Dalal Street.
Does the inside trading happen much more often and just few people get caught, or this is just a relatively rare phenomenon?
Do you want me to answer?
Anita, it's...
I think there are waves, and I think insider trading is rampant. It probably happens less often today than it did in 2008 and 2009, but I think it's a common feature of the landscape of Wall Street, and it's inevitable because you have so much information sloshing around, and some of it is truly confidential information, and some of it is pure rumor. So yes, I think it's an endemic problem on Wall Street.
You're right up front here on the first row, please.
Thank you very much. A most insightful story, extraordinary, and the timing of it. It's just, Krista Darling is my name. I have a question. Will you be able to distribute the book into your country?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think there are plans afoot to do that at some point. We're the world's greatest democracy.
This is not a book
you can
about...
do a lot of things in India that you can't do in many countries.
Unless you're writing about a business group, they might buy up all the copies. Which has happened in the past. I think right there.
Anita, I'm quite perplexed by the fact you said Preet Bharara tried to pick the low-hanging fruit when he went after Rajat. The intriguing part is there's not one shred of evidence presented that holds him responsible. In spite of all the hours of wiretapping, there's not one shred of evidence. You don't find that funny?
Well, again, a lot of South Asians focus on evidence as being a wiretap. You have to remember this was the first case where wiretaps were used to prosecute insider trading. Insider trading has been prosecuted for the last 20 years with circumstantial evidence. And I don't know if you sat through the trial as I did, but the circumstantial evidence was quite compelling.
By that you mean the timing of the phone calls?
The timing of the phone calls and...
Just after the board meetings.
And, on the day, let's talk about the Goldman Sachs...
Warren Buffett
investment.
As a follow-on, those that were circumstantial were beneficiaries of those transactions. There's been no link between Rajat and him receiving any funds of any of those transactions. So
well,
I'm not sure that issue...
No, that's not right, actually. There was a case in 2008 against a Credit Suisse banker. The U.S. Attorney's Office could not at trial show that money had gone to the banker. There was no benefit. They were trying to allege that there was a man in Pakistan who may have gotten some money, and he was kicking it back to the Credit Suisse banker, but there was no actual display of it. And benefit is a very nebulous term in insider trading cases, and it doesn't have to be money handed over in suitcases like Marty Siegel received in the late 80s. It can be benefit as general business ties will lead to greater business.
In fact, there's a little description in the book about the judge saying that, there were no suitcases of cash, so
Right.
it was, this was not as exciting a trial as the previous ones. Can we just have, yeah.
Can I? Okay. It's a simple psychological question. Was Rajat's father a financial failure? Because of that, he was determined to prove the exact opposite, thereby, and all this greed came from there.
Rajat was came from very humble roots, and when his father came out of jail, there's a document in the British Library that I uncovered. He had, 1,000. It's either, sorry, I'm doing this from memory. It was something like 10,000 rupees in debt, which is an enormous amount of money for that time. And Rajat, again, in this talk that he gave at Columbia, he said that how his father was someone, if anyone asked for his shirt off his back, he would give it to them. And he said we were very lucky, because had it not been for our mother, who put aside some money, we would have been starving. We would have been on the street when our parents died. So I do think, he grew up at a very young age, learning the importance of the security that came from wealth.
Right.
Hello.
Hi.
And I wanted to ask you, you had said that you believe that this scandal, these problems, are going to reflect badly upon the South Asian community. I know that The Economist magazine disagreed with that finding, although they found your book to be extraordinarily well written. They said that analysis was, in their minds, quote-unquote, nonsense. I wanted to know why you think the actions of two people is going to reflect badly upon 3 million in this country or 1 billion worldwide. That's one question. If you can answer the question that if why was it in your investigative journalism did you find that, why were these two wiretapped? If this is not a standard practice and no one else has ever been wiretapped or prosecuted based on wiretaps, why were these two, Rajaratnam and Raj Gupta, wiretapped? And I'm sorry, but lastly, as a Sri Lankan, I must ask you, when you talk about the Indian diaspora, are you including all South Asians in your analysis, or just people from India?
Okay, let me answer question 2 first. Why were these two wiretapped? They weren't the only two wiretapped. Daniel Chiesi was wiretapped, Zvi Goffer was wiretapped. There were a number of others wiretapped. They even tried to get not a wiretap, but they in the summer of 2009 tried to get a former associate of Stevie Cohen to record him in incriminating conversations, and he didn't take the bait. To your question 3, my book, while Raj was obviously the person who was the catalyst, if you will, I was really focused on the Indian diaspora, Rajat Gupta, Anil Kumar, because these were individuals who were the best and brightest of the Indian community. They went to the establishment schools, they joined the establishment companies. They were very different from Raj, who was actually on the fringes of Wall Street. He was at Needham before he started Galleon, and he became a success through Galleon. And to your first question, I think when the adaptation of my book ran in the New York Times, I read a number of the comments, and I find comments to stories more fascinating these days than even the stories, actually. And it was stunning to me, but there were a number of people who said, essentially, what do you expect? These are South Asians, or So I do think it will have an effect on the community. I'm not saying, by the same token, I did mention that Srinivasan's probably going to be confirmed for the federal appeals court in D.C. It's not devastating, but it will in the short term, I think. Particularly on Wall Street.
Has he already been confirmed, or?
No.
He has been confirmed.
Yeah, he's been confirmed by the Senate, but not the.
Just, follow on from there, Anita. Do you think, in another context, I mean, back home, so to speak, would, Raj and Rajat ever, would their paths ever cross? Would they be friends? I mean, would they have, they just seemed like two different.
I personally don't think they would have, and look, they weren't friends outside of business. They didn't socialize together. Rajat didn't go to Raj's 50th birthday party in Kenya. This was a marriage of mutual interest, for a particular period of time.
Right at the back there. Yeah.
You went, as if referring to the appellate court, Second Circuit arguments. You were there, I presume. I saw you.
For the Raj.
So you were there for Rajat Gupta's argument.
No, I was not there.
You were not there, but you wrote a piece on Hindu business line.
Yeah.
Okay, you were not there.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I had someone there.
Okay, I was there. Let me just ask you very quickly. There are 3 points: the two wiretaps, September 24th and October 24th.
Right.
And the argument is they are hearsay.
Right.
And October 24th seems to be accepted even by Richard Turlow, U.S. Attorney's Office, kind of conceding. But September 24th.
There's no September 24th wiretap. There's only an October 24th.
No, that is September 23rd or 24th when.
That's not a wiretap. That's just a phone call.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Recording. The big one is the Geetanjali's extended testimony.
Right.
Abbreviated versus extended.
Right.
To me, the claim appears very difficult for Rajat in the appeals court.
Right.
And John Newman asked the question with, so what is your take on it in terms of what you heard from the appellate court? What tea leaves do you read?
Right. I mean, obviously, it's a panel of 3 judges. I think one of the judges is seen to be generally pro the defense, just my reporting of the judge. The other judge is... Yes, that's right. Yeah. And the other judge is pro prosecution. And I think that's right. And John Newman... yes, but John Newman, I think... Rajat's lawyers really look to John Newman as being kind of the wild card, and someone, because he's very intellectually rigorous, and I think they came away disappointed by the questions he asked.
Rajat's lawyers came away disappointed.
Yeah.
Right there. Yeah, sorry. Next over here, the second row after them.
Hi, my name is Nizar Mohammed, and I actually worked the 2000-2003 while Rajat was the managing partner there. And just speaking of somebody who was at McKinsey and knowing a lot of colleagues there, the sense of betrayal of Rajat Gupta is so acute. It's mind-boggling. At a firm like McKinsey, and I'm sure all the big consulting firms, your absolute key is client confidentiality. To the extent that 10 years, 8 years after I've left McKinsey, I still don't talk about who my clients were, even though they don't exist anymore. So that's the first point. The second point is, impact on South Asians. A lot of consultants, McKinsey consultants who are Indian origin have, in just the chatter that goes across the networks, have felt that now they'll be set up for special scrutiny. They kind of feel like they're part of the Indian mafia at McKinsey, and that does cast a disparaging shadow on them. I'm not saying it's going to be widespread or it's going to be long-lasting, but there certainly is a bit of that impact there.
So I was wondering what... Yeah.
Well, I mean,
is there
I think
a specific question? Okay. Right here in the second row, please.
Yeah, hi, my name is Harish Chug. And my question is, I take it you didn't speak to or interview Rajat for this book?
I'm not going to comment on, I don't want to comment on sources. Okay.
And I'm also I'm also a little kind of perplexed too that if you were talking to his family members or cousins in Calcutta, did they know the subject material of the book? Obviously, it's not putting him in a good light.
They did.
And they were willingly giving you all this information?
Well, it was, a lot of the book is about, I think Nazneen and various other people have said that it's a very sympathetic portrayal of him. So, that's what they contributed to.
And one last thing about this, this wiretap, this conversation that he had after the board meeting of Goldman, is that on tape or no?
No, there's no wiretap. But what I was, in answering the previous gentleman's question, what I was trying to say is that this is the first case where wiretaps have been used, and there have been insider trading cases brought in the 80s, in the 90s, post-millennium against Caucasians and others. And all of them have been brought using circumstantial evidence. And the Credit Suisse banker that I mentioned, where there was no benefit was shown, there was just this allegation that this man was tipping someone in Pakistan who was placing trades. This man was sentenced to 8 years in prison on circumstantial evidence.
But Anita, wasn't there one phone call? That conversation.
It's July 29th, 2008.
Where he talks, Raj is sort of complaining about Anil Kumar and saying, I give him $1 million for what? And Rajat says, well, he should be more thankful. And, he's hardly paying attention.
Right.
So wasn't that...
That was a wiretap conversation, but that was not that was not part of the charges because, the information being passed did not rise to material non-public.
That particular... I don't want to take away. To Harish's question, the one for which he's charged immediately out of the board meeting on September 23rd, I think that's right.
That's right.
That wasn't on the tape or wiretap because they're only this came up during the hearing. Rosemary Puller asked exactly that.
Right.
And Rajaratnam's only cell phone was tapped, but not the home phone.
And the office phone was not tapped.
The office phone was
home, so they don't have it on the tape, that particular.
Right.
Here in the second row, please.
I'm John Laxmi, a fund manager. Should the title of this book have been The Rise of Rajat Gupta and the Fall of Galleon Fund rather than The Rise of the Indian American Elite? I've not read the book yet, but I looked at the table of contents and read the excerpt in New York Times, and it looks like it's all about Rajat Gupta, not about the Indian American elite in general, about Vinod Khosla or Sanjay Gupta or Srikant Srinivasan, all of this, many elites that have gone up. And in titling books like this that way, perhaps you're going to cause a self-fulfilling prophecy of casting a shadow over the whole diaspora.
No, I think all I was trying to do was I think Rajat Gupta was an important member of the community, and I think his journey was similar to the journey of many in the community. The rise, the explosive rise in such a short period of time, and sometimes you use one character to show what a community has done, and I think certainly his rise was emblematic of the communities.
But this book is more about his fall too than the rise.
I actually think the book is. I think the book spends a lot of time on his rise.
I'll read it.
Okay.
Also, the title of the book.
We can count pages later. Okay.
Yeah. And the title of the book is The Billionaire's Apprentice. So it's clearly about one person in that sense, but placed in the broader context. I mean, that's how I understood it.
Right.
Right there, James. That corner.
Hi, good evening. My name is Megha Lal, And I'm part of that wave of diaspora you spoke about that came in the 1960s. And although I have not read your book, I find that it takes a tremendous amount of courage and strength for us as a diaspora to be reflective and look back at ourselves. And despite all of our strengths and all of the success we've had, I think it's very important for our growth to also recognize some of the things that we have not done with good ethics and have not conducted ourselves in the way in which we should. So thank you for that. My question related to that is, what insight or perspective would you offer to the next generation of diaspora that is up and coming now, that is applying to college and looking at their career path? What perspective could you offer?
I actually think they have an advantage that certainly my parents' generation, which is the same generation as really Rajat's generation, didn't have. And they grew up in the United States, and they are assimilated, and they, I think, have a better appreciation of the rigidity, if you will, of laws in the United States, the lack of gray, and I think that's why, this is a story about South Asians, but it's also a story of two different generations of South Asians. Rajat Gupta, Anil Kumar, they were one generation, and even though Preet Bharara was born in India, he came here when he was 2, and he's a different generation. And I think what we're seeing is I think the assimilated Indian will be very successful in this country. I don't think they need any advice from me.
Hi, my name is Bharati Mukherjee, and I attended the Rajat Gupta trials last summer, and it was fascinating just seeing the whole family and, whether it was acting or a genuine grief and regret going along. But I would like a little more on the tipping point that you brought up very early in the conversation, where in that Columbia speech that you referenced, he seemed confused about what's the next step, how to go higher. How does wanting to hang out with Henry Kravis and that kind of sophisticated billionaire glamorous set, and at the same time wanting a little more money via Rajaratnam, I just don't understand how Rajaratnam won the poll, that instead of wanting to be in that elite class of sophisticated billionaires, how is it simply greed by your analysis? Is it simply greed that attracted Rajat Gupta to, and like this gentleman here, I never heard on tape anything, any words from Rajat to say that he had actually given the tips. My second question, and that's what I'm even more interested in, is did the wiretapping of Rajaratnam begin because of speculation about his association with terrorism in Sri Lanka, giving aid, financial aid to the Tamil Tigers? Is, in other words, Rajat Gupta collateral damage for something else that the government was interested in uncovering?
Well, to your second question, Subramaniam Swamy certainly feels that, he told me that he wrote a letter in 2006 to the U.S. State Department saying, look, Rajaratnam is funding, the Tamil Tigers, and Subramaniam Swamy, if you haven't read the book, was actually also the person who wrote the recommendation to Rajat Gupta when he applied to Harvard Business School from IIT, and he felt that he had sort of paved the way for the feds to start looking at Rajaratnam. I don't think. I think they were, again. I think it's sort of the sausage is far messier. The sausage making is far messier. I think there were two parallel investigations going on by two competing U.S. attorneys' offices of Rajaratnam. One was the insider trading investigation that was happening in the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office, and the other was the investigation in the Eastern District into the terrorism activities. And the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office, which is known as the Sovereign District of New York, eventually won out, and the insider trading case went forward. To your first question, I think Rajat saw Rajaratnam as someone who could help him make up for lost time in terms of wealth creation. Rajat had this wonderful Rolodex. He talked to people about wanting to, quote unquote, monetize his Rolodex. What did Rajaratnam need? He needed more money to manage, and so Rajat saw himself as possibly teaming up with him and making that into a lucrative venture.
Before we, there's that point where you talk about how the balance of power between the two shifted. I mean, Rajaratnam being very, wanting to get plugged into those higher circles, and then when Rajat gets the KKR offer, he asks Rajaratnam, what do you think? And he's asking him for his advice.
Right.
And that. So, do you think that balance of power had shifted and Rajaratnam had the upper hand at the stage when the whole thing blew up?
Yeah, I do. I think when Rajat first, got close to Rajaratnam, I think he thought he came from a position of superiority. I mean, he was the one who had, the great contacts, the remarkable Rolodex. But by the time you get to that conversation, he's asking. Here's a man who his entire life had been giving, advice to other corporations, advice to boards. He was the one who had actually worked at the preeminent firm, in the financial services industry. And here he was asking someone who had never actually, succeeded in a firm like KKR, for advice on whether he should take this job. And it's sort of a stunning turn of events.
Can we go at the back, please? There, right at the back.
So my question is related to Rajat's early career, from his college days in IIT Delhi. So he probably graduated sometime in late 60s or early 70s, if I'm not wrong.
1971.
Right. So, and I've read everywhere that Rajat comes from a humble background where he probably had financial troubles at his home. How could he afford to go to Harvard Business School?
He got a scholarship.
Okay. Okay. Plus, this related question is, how did Rajat manage to grow inside McKinsey? I am assuming that, once again, that there are not many Indian Americans at McKinsey at that time. Was it primarily during the late 80s that the McKinsey board recognized that there's probably ample opportunities outside of the North American and European markets? So do we need someone who will go out into the Asian markets to grow it? So was that primary criteria, or was he simply the best in the league that he was promoted?
I mean, you have to remember McKinsey is a partnership, and so Rajat got the top job because he was elected by his partners. So there was no board or anything appointing him, and I think one of the reasons Rajat was elected to the top job is that in the early 90s, again, there was this generational split at McKinsey. There was the old guard that was represented by people like Don Waite and Herb Hensler, and there was a new and up-and-coming guard, and Rajat was the perfect candidate. You know, he was thoughtful, he was soft-spoken, he was non-confrontational, and I think the new guard, you know, gravitated around him. And Jeff Skilling, who was at McKinsey at the time, you know, and was actually, people laugh, but he was very. I had a lot of correspondence with Jeff Skilling, and he's a beautiful writer and very eloquent, and a very smart man. And he sort of laid out the landscape at McKinsey during the 80s and 90s, and the tensions between these two different generations. And I think Rajat came out of that fight successful.
Jerry Baranda. I'm Asian but not Indian. Very obvious, right? Your comment, please, on how the reforms in the Basel III banking reform would have affected many of these events, and more importantly, the future of those financial wizard wannabes. I'm talking about specifically about the transparency brought about by the Basel III.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. I'm not sure the transparency brought about Basel III would have affected these insider trading cases. I'm not sure how that would have affected it, to be honest with you.
Hi, Anita.
Hi.
We've talked a lot about Rajat Gupta. I'm curious just to hear from you more about Raj Rajaratnam and his motivations and kind of just the dynamic of him and his family, and also Rangan Rajaratnam, who is now facing prosecution.
Right.
What do you think is going to happen there? If you have any comment, we'd love to hear.
Raj Rajaratnam, to use his own words, would say, "I'm a rogue," okay? And I'm a rogue. Yeah. And I think that's what he was. He liked to push the envelope wherever he could. He liked to play people. There's this episode in the relationship between Rajat and Raj, where it's at the end of 2006, and Rajat has arranged this high-interest loan for his friend Ramesh Vangal, and they're part of a consortium to buy a bank in South India, and the loan isn't paid back in time, and Raj sends Rajat an email saying, if the money doesn't arrive, I'm canceling all further lunches regarding Taj Capital, which of course was the South Asian money manager that Rajat was trying to build. And so Raj had this, a keen sense of people. He was very street smart. He could do circles around the McKinsey men. In terms of Rangan, which is Raj's brother, it's interesting to see that Rangan is taking a very different approach from his brother to his recent indictment on charges of insider trading. It appears that he's trying to work out a plea with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I suspect if he does plead guilty, he will just plead guilty and not cooperate, because if he was to cooperate, he would also have to give the prosecutors information about his brothers, and there's still one brother, RK, that they would be interested in building a case against.
You know, I know there's lots of hands there. We're going to take a last question from that gentleman there. And then, at this rate, Anita, you're going to be reading out, virtually disclosing the whole book. So
Okay.
we'll just take a last question.
I'm not sure it's actually a question. It might be just a comment. But the one comment was, first of all, I never considered Gupta Indian. I never thought about it, and I was very interested in the case. And I'm sure a lot of people that I know never really said Indian. And I'm not an Indian, and I didn't discuss this with any Indians. So I wonder whether maybe it's just like a Indian thing. Like, it's just like my parents are Nigerian, and I work in financial crime compliance. So it's, it's, I'm always just like, oh God, Nigerians, ugh. And I wonder if it's so I wonder if it's this Indian thing where it's like, oh, an Indian, like, because, and the other comment that I had was, I wonder if this is just like a stereotype thing. The stereotypes of Indians are they're very smart, they're docile, they're hardworking, and here's an Indian that did something bad. I wonder if this is actually, I don't want to say progress, but it's, I'm really not trying to be funny.
Okay.
No. So, and this is just from an outsider point of view, as in, I wonder if it's just like, I'm listening to everybody talk about how this is so bad for Indians, and I'm just like, Indians kind of have it very good to have a very good stereotype attached to you. And now here's just one bad case. I guess, I don't know if Michael Matoma, who just got indicted, is an Indian, but...
Yeah.
So, this is the second one, but, it's...
I think... Anita, I don't know whether you have any sign of comment, or we can just close this at this point. And Anita is going to be available now to sign copies of a book if you're interested in purchasing it. And thank you so much, Anita. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much. Thank you.